Good morning and welcome to this Friday session organized by B'Yachad Together, spirited by AJU. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning. We are so grateful for your participation. My name is Dr. Rotem Rosenthal, and I'm the Chief Curator of AJU and Senior Director of Arts and Culture. And as I was mentioning earlier, when we were preparing for this webinar, I am outnumbered by beards this morning, which is also, I think, one of the signs of the time. So I don't know how you are doing at home, but I hope you're well and maybe beardless. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome everybody here today to today's session, Why Meir Kahane Matters, with two very esteemed scholars, rabbis and professors, Professor Aryeh Cohen and Professor Shaul Magid. Aryeh Cohen is Professor of Rabbinic Studies at American Jewish University. We're proud to call him our colleague. He's also a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America and rabbi in residence at Bent the Ark. Professor Shaul Magid is Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. He is also a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. He's a contributing editor to Tablet Magazine and rabbi of the Fire Island Synagogue. They will be in conversation this morning about Meir Kahane and its relevance to our histories. Please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and they will be addressing that later on in their conversation, but please feel free to share your questions with us throughout. So again, thank you so much for being with us today, and I will hand it over to you, Professor Cohen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rotem. So Shaul, good morning.
Good morning.
Well, where you are, it's beginning of the afternoon, but you know, the magic of Zoom. There's so much to talk about here, but I think the basic question is, why Kahane? And if you look at most, as you pointed out, if you look at many surveys of American Jewish history in the mid 20th century, late 20th century, they basically gloss over Kahane. And lots of American Jews have very mixed opinions about Kahane. Most of them, a lot of them negative, some of them very positive. So why is Kahane worthy of this kind of research?
Well, I think in a certain sense, precisely, because of what you said, I think that, I discovered him. I actually knew about him when I lived in Brooklyn, but really discovered him as a scholarly subject some years ago when I was directing an MA thesis by a graduate student on history and memory and Kahane's thought, which he came up with because in my 2015 book, American Post-Judaism, I have a chapter on Holocaust, and I deal with Kahane's response to the Holocaust and the way in which, and the role that a Holocaust plays. So that's how I kind of discovered him. But as I started to kind of dig deeper, I started to realize, in a certain sense, precisely what you said, is a person that has been, by and large, kind of villainized by most of American Jewry. In some cases lionized by a small minority of people. And what I came to realize is that we understand Kahane backwards. In other words, most of us, when we think about Meir Kahane, certainly in the 21st century, we think about his career in Israel, we think about the Kach party, we think about the Kahanist movement as it exists today in kind of contemporary politics. And we don't really think much about Kahane as an American Jewish figure. And I think, in a certain sense, he's most important and most interesting and most influential as an American Jewish thinker, and the role that he played in the mid to late 1960s through the early 1970s, a very, very tumultuous time in American history and American Jewish history, the race wars, the assassination of, Kennedy and King, right? I mean, those years from 1966 to 1974 were incredibly tumultuous years in America. And Kahane was really very much on the vanguard, not only of constructing and presenting a kind of countercultural Jewish vision, but being a part of that counterculture, not from the side of the left, but as a critique of the left.
And so I want to jump in right there. And, you speak very interestingly about Kahane's ethics of violence. This week is the 50th anniversary of the Kent State massacre. Violence was kind of a much more common trope culturally and actually in American society in the 60s, and which Kahane really, I think, both used rhetorically and used actually. How did Kahane fit into a spectrum which included everybody from the weathermen to Abby Hoffman to nonviolent activists like Art Waskow and the other new Jews? Where is Kahane and his use of violence, and how did that fit into that American moment?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I mean, I think the closer example to Kahane's use of violence is really the Black Panthers. And that's an organization that he, in some way, was very opposed to, and in another way, modeled himself very much around. I mean, there's a chapter in his book, The Story of the Jewish Fence League, called The Jewish Panthers, right? So he did see the JDL as the Jewish Panthers. So the interesting thing is that a lot of these radical groups, the Weathermen, the Panthers, the Young Lords, the Puerto Rican Young Lords, were basically using violence as a tactic to wage a kind of war against what they would call the liberal establishment. And from the perspective of the far left, Kahane is waging a war against the liberal establishment, and more particularly against the liberal Jewish establishment, but he's doing it from the right. And that really didn't exist. So in a sense, what Kahane is doing, he's using the tactics of the left in order to achieve the goals of the right. And what do the goals of the right mean for him? The goals of the right meant for him contesting anti-Semitism, contesting assimilation, fighting against what he considered to be reverse racism of African Americans against Jews, and creating a certain sense of Jewish pride that later morphed into a certain kind of program of the American Jewish establishment that wasn't the case in the 1960s. So one of the things that I think I'm trying to get out of the book is that we think about the influence of Kahane today in Israel. You know, Kahane Tzedek, as Kahane was right, graffitied on the walls around Israel, and Otzma Yehudit and the Kahanist parties. But Kahane's worldview, I think, has been in many ways absorbed by the contemporary American Jewish establishment in ways that they don't really are not willing to acknowledge.
I want to push you on that point, because when you say that Kahane was attacking the establishment from the right, nowadays when we think about what it means to attack from the right, we think about either the alt-right or anti-Semitism coming out of various politicians. How did Kahane finish this? And I just want to quote you right, and at one point, for Kahane, violence does not only protect the Jew, and thus it is not just a social need, it also constructs the Jew and is thus an existential need. And that's something that seems very foreign to a contemporary American mindset.
Yes, that's true. And I think that when you think about Kahane and the use of violence as self-fashioning, you have to really think of Frantz Fanon and post-colonialism. Because although Kahane was not reading Fanon, the Black Panthers were reading Fanon, and a lot of the people on the radical left were reading Fanon. And I think that Kahane is offering a kind of Fanonian reading of the Jewish situation in America. So one of the things I argue,
we have to explain just
yes. So Frantz Fanon, so we don't have that much time, but Frantz Fanon was a Martinican. Actually psychoanalyst, but he played a very important role in the rebellion in Algeria against French colonialism. And he justified the use of violence not only to combat the colonial power, but also to recreate a sense of distinct identity and pride in the colonized. And I think that Kahane saw anti-Semitism in America as a kind of form of colonialism, that the Jews were locked into a very particular reality where anti-Semitism was an endemic part of the society they lived in, and that liberalism's attempt to diminish anti-Semitism through accommodation, through acculturation, through liberalism, was ultimately bound to fail. And the only way to contest anti-Semitism would be the way that the colonized are able to contest colonialism, that is through violence, not only as a way of making it such that the non-Jew feared the Jew, but it gave the Jew a sense of an ability to reconstruct their identity in a post-Holocaust world. So in a certain sense, his real audience were children of survivors. Survivors who were upset, annoyed, disgusted by their parents' quiescence, their inability to fight back, their unwillingness to be able to stand up for themselves. And in a certain sense, he instills this kind of post-colonialist ethos into that population. And again, he says in a number of places, his view of violence is actually quite complicated, that he says that violence is a tool in order to achieve a particular goal, a kind of revolutionary goal. And he was a revolutionary in that way. He wanted to reconstruct diasporic Jewish identity. That was basically his program, right? So he was against liberalism as a tool of American Jewish accommodationalism. And in that sense, I think he was incredibly successful, which is why he became so successful in the Soviet Jewry movement, which we'll get to.
Talk about. I just want to remind everybody that I'm Aryeh Cohen, and talking with Professor Shaul Magid of Dartmouth University, whose new book, Meir Kahane, an American Jewish Radical, is coming out speedily and in our days.
Right.
From where? Who's publishing it?
Princeton University Press.
From Princeton University Press. So there were two things that you brought up there. One that might strike people as odd is that Kahane was developing a diasporic identity, since he is well known, as you said, when we read him backwards, as a very strong Zionist. The other is that your remarks about colonialism and being anti-integrationist resonate with people like Stokely Carmichael and the Black Power movement and Black nationalism.
Sure.
He had a strange relationship with them.
Yes, he had a strange relationship with them, but he respected them. He respected Malcolm X. He respected Stokely Carmichael. He respected Rhodey McCoy and Sonny Carson, who were two kind of local Black nationalists in Brooklyn. He certainly respected them, and he understood the plight of the African American in the 1960s. I also want to kind of bring up that. One of the things that I think is interesting about Kahane is that the rise of Jewish neoconservatism, which doesn't really happen until the 1980s or the late 1970s, is something that he was actually speaking about, not within that language, in the 1960s. So interestingly enough, you have on the one hand the group called the New York Intellectuals, Norman Podhoretz and Irving Howe and the commentary crowd, who were living on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And they were moving into this neoconservative view of criticizing liberalism, particularly as it emerged out of the student protests. And then you have Kahane in Brooklyn, who founds the JDL. In many ways, they were speaking similar languages, but they had absolutely nothing to do with each other.
Right.
Now, I think there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, the New York Intellectuals were a secular group of people. They were not interested in violence, and they were also mostly made up of German Jewish immigrants, although there were Eastern European Jews as well. It's interesting. Kahane notes in a number of places that he had submitted various articles to commentary, none of which were accepted. And there are a number of different essays that come out against Kahane in.
On the other hand, he wrote most of the Jewish press for years.
Yes, anonymously, right. The other thing I want to bring up here is that the entire career of Kahane in America is only about 6 years. From around 1967, he publishes a book in 1967 with a friend of his, Joseph Khurba, called The Jewish Stake in Vietnam, arguing that Jews are making a big mistake getting involved in the anti-war movement because Vietnam is an important front in the battle, not only against communism, but against the rise of the power of the Arabs in Israel. He felt there was this triangle between Middle East, China, and the Soviet Union. And in 1968, he founds the JDL. he basically testifies before the House, what's it called? I'm forgetting now the name of the HUAC, the basically
House Un-American Activities Committee.
Yeah, he in June of '68, he testifies before Congress on the Soviet Jewry movement and about Soviet communism. Now, he was no expert in Soviet communism, so it's not really clear how they came to him, but it's a fascinating document. His testimony is actually quite fascinating because he tries to show that there is this Soviet, Chinese, Arab triangle that's going on, and that in a certain sense, this is going to be detrimental to Israel. So communism is a really, really important piece of his thinking.
And this actually brings up an important point where Kahane is in '68, where he discovers, as it were, Soviet Jewry, which people have been talking about. Elie Wiesel published Jews of Silence in the early '60s. Birnbaum started the student struggle for Soviet Jewry in the mid '60s up in Yeshiva University, and then other people were getting. But then Meir Kahane kind of ended up almost owning the Soviet Jewry movement. So could you talk a little bit about that and how that happened?
Well, it's funny because he writes an article in 1964 called "To Save Soviet Jewry in the Jewish Press," and then that's exactly when the Soviet Jewry movement began, 1964, with Yaakov Birnbaum. It also happens to be the founding of the PLO, the same year, 1964, and then he writes nothing about Soviet Jewry until late in 1969. When, according to a JDL archive records, he comes into the JDL office in New York and he says, we're going to basically spend all of our time and resources now on the Soviet Jewry movement. And he had never talked about it before to the other people that were there. So why he decides to kind of invest so much time and energy into Soviet Jewry is a good question. But he does. And very, very quickly, according to Gal Beckerman's great book about the history of the Soviet Jewry movement, by early 1970, he pretty much takes over the movement. And he could have taken over the movement if not for the fact that he couldn't seem to resist engaging in violence and engaging in illegal activities, including arms smuggling and explosive and things like that. So in a sense, Kahane really is his own worst enemy. Every time he really sits on the precipice of a much greater success than he had, he always seems to undermine himself.
Kahane always presented himself as an Orthodox rabbi, and that was kind of his. But Kahane has kind of a back history, and this shadow of scandal, which always, followed him or was around him because he had an affair with a non-Jewish woman who ended up committing suicide. He worked with the FBI, as you mentioned, with his friend Churba. How did that? Did that impact his career at all? Was that a factor, or was it only later on that it became a way to attack him?
It didn't seem to be much of a factor, and I've spoken to a couple of JDL people and asked them, well, what happened after the suicide of that woman? I mean, did some of his followers hold Kahane accountable? And he said, no, they didn't really care. Didn't really mean anything to them. So in a way, look, he's obviously a very, very tortured, very complicated, in many ways, a very tragic figure. I think he seemed to have incredible talent to be able to understand the pulse of a particular subset of the American Jewish community post-Holocaust. And he was able to really convince them that the American liberal establishment was undermining the possibility for the continuation of Judaism in America. So, in the Aims and Purposes document, which is an early document that was unpublished in the Kahane archives, he says the purpose of the JDL is to save the American dream for Jews. It was a diasporic project. It wasn't an Israeli project. In fact, if you look at his early writings, Never Again, the book Never Again that was published in 1971, only has one chapter on Zionism. There's nothing about making Aliyah. There's nothing about, American Jews have to go to Israel. There's nothing about that. Nor is there much about religion or Judaism. His early writings, I don't think that Kahane can really be considered to be a religious Jewish thinker until probably the early 1980s. he doesn't really engage in religion per se. He uses religion as a tool of pride, but he was ultimately interested in identity. He was interested in cultivating a strong sense of Jewish identity and a strong sense of Jewish survival. And in certain sense, that has been absorbed by what's become the continuity industry in the American Jewish establishment today. We talk about continuity, resources are poured into continuity. Kahane just used the word survivalism, but it was basically the same thing.
This opens up a whole spectrum of questions. I just want to remind people that I'm Aryeh Cohen. I'm a professor at American Jewish University, and I'm talking with Professor Shaul Magid of Dartmouth, who just finished a book called Meir Kahane, an American Jewish Radical, which will be coming out soon. This program is a program of Biachad Together, a program of American Jewish University. So I wanted to come back to two things you mentioned. One, it seems that Kahane fits into this whole Kiruv movement that started, he predates the Kiruv movement, this kind of internal Jewish missionary movement of making people religious, where the whole point was just making them religious without, as you mentioned, any real ritual content aside from pride. And the other part of this is that you have an interest in the book. You talk about this interesting confluence where he goes to Israel, and there he takes up to a certain extent, takes up the complaints of the Mizrahi community against the Ashkenazi elite, but the radical Mizrahim who actually fashioned themselves on the American Panthers reject him.
Right.
So if you could talk about, how race in America does not play out as well for Kahane as race in Israel in terms of leveraging himself, and also where he fits in with this whole Kiruv movement in America.
Right. Well, I mean, the Kiruv thing is, I think also, if you look at that early Aims and Purposes document, that was one of the early documents of the JDL, he saw the JDL as a kind of Kiruv movement of sorts. And he saw that basically the liberal Jewish establishment of the synagogue was a failure. And he was really kind of an anti-materialist, anti-bourgeois thinker. So he's always making fun of the Jews of Scarsdale and the Jews of Great Neck and the conservative temples and the Reformed temples and so on and so forth.
That's like Abby Hoffman has this great line, my Reformed temple when I was growing up had all the spirituality of a Howard Johnson's. That's something that Kahane could have said.
Well, there was an interview that Abby Hoffman did where they asked him, what do you think of Meir Kahane? And he said, I agree with his tactics, but not his goals. So, and Kahane wrote an obituary for Abby Hoffman in the Jewish press after Abby Hoffman died.
But that's actually, I think that's a really insightful statement, because the point should be goals and not tactics. But a lot of the point of the Yippies and of JDL was about the tactics themselves. As you said, violence is self-fashioning, that it was actually the getting out in the street in the denim jackets and the motorcycle chains and the nunchaku as an end in itself.
Right. And there is also, first of all, there's a whole other discussion to have about the whole theatrics and the performative nature of the JDL that's a kind of a separate discussion. But there was a sense, and here you can look at Kahane as a certain kind of, I don't want to turn to Israel, as a certain kind of germ cell of what becomes later the Jewish social justice movement, again, to different ends. But basically, Kahane wanted to create a Judaism of the street. That was what the social protest was. He gave a talk at the March 1971 Soviet Jewry protest in Washington, where all these 1,200 young Jews were arrested, and he basically said to them, "This is your bar mitzvah. This is your initiation into Jewishness. It's not having a kiddush or a smorgasbord or Viennese table in some venue. It's basically getting arrested for a Jewish cause." So this, in a certain sense, he wanted to take the radical left that was then being alienated, the Jewish radical left that was then being alienated after 1967, because of the Six-Day War and the rise of the kind of the affiliation of the Black Panthers with the Palestinian movement. And he wanted to basically say, yes, you're radicalized and you should be radicalized, but now be radical as a Jew.
So how does that fit in with the other like new Jews like Arthur Waskow or?
I have a chapter called I have a chapter called "Strange Bedfellows." The Meir Kahane and the radical Jews in the 1960s. If you look at the radical Jews, people like Aviva Cantor, people like Arthur Waskow, and many others, Max Tickton, that they were engaged in a certain kind of radicalized project against the liberal establishment, which was exactly what Kahane was engaged with. And in turn, there's an interesting meeting of Chavurah movement people and JDL people and people that were in other kind of radical movements that largely coalesced around Soviet Jewry. So Soviet Jewry was where the right and the left came together in a certain sense, certainly within the youth. What happens in Israel, though, is interesting because in the chapter on race, I mean, his views of race is very, very complicated. I mean, he certainly, the question of was Kahane a racist or not, I don't really like to use that language. He was certainly an expert in the grammar of race. He knew how to use race to his benefit. He has an article that he published in the Jewish press called My Brother David, which was about David Solomon, an African-American convert to Judaism, and how, the fact that Kahane doesn't see David Solomon as any different than any other Jew proves that he's not a racist. Anyway, we can go back and forth on that. But the problem with Israel, and this is why he's totally a failure in Israel, I think he's totally a failure in Israel, because he took the racial categories of the late 60s race wars in America and just tried to transplant them to Israel. But in Israel, it was a much more complicated story. For example, the Black Panthers in Israel, who were the Mizrahim who were fighting against the Ashkenazi elite, also identified with the Arab population because they saw themselves as people of color. And they saw Kahane really as part of the Ashkenazi group. So Kahane becomes white in Israel to the Mizrahim in a way that he wasn't quite white in America to the liberal establishment. So he never really successfully transfers the thinking of his American experience to Israel, which is why I think that there is a success of Kahanism in Israel, but it's really not Kahane. It's really a kind of neo-Kahanism. So I'll give you one example. Throughout Kahane's writings, up into the late 80s, there's almost never a mention of Rev Kook. He has no interest in Rev Kook. There's one photograph of him.
Major thinker of Rev Kook is the major thinker of Messianic Zionism. Right.
Not only Abraham Isaac Kook, the original, but also Tzvi Yehuda Kook, who was alive, very much alive and practicing, a part of the scene at that point. And the reason that Kahane doesn't like Rev Kook is that Rev Kook was a romantic, mystic Messianist, and Kahane was none of those. He basically was not interested in any of that kind of transvaluation of the secular. He considered secular Zionists racist, Kahane. There was no value to the secular state. There was only value to creating a Torah state, not through some kind of mystical dialectic which would bring about the transvaluation of the kibbutzim. No, it was basically going to war against the secular state. So what happens in Israel is a kind of, after Kahane dies, is a kind of an interesting amalgam of Kookism and Kahanism that comes together. And what we're seeing today in the Otzma Yehudit movement and some of the other Kahanists, it's all basically a kind of neo-Kahanist movement that has very little to do with Kahane. I don't think it's something that he would have really recognized.
So in a certain way, in a certain paradoxical way, Kahane, I mean, I remember Kahane towards the end of his life, the hatred was basically his top rhetorical device. He hated leftists, he hated Arabs, he hated Likud, he hated the Labor Party, he hated Ashkenazi, there's just like real hatred and vitriol as kind of his rhetorical move.
Right.
What you're saying, you also introduced this notion, which is now flourished, that revenge is a central kind of a central pillar of Judaism. Revenge is sanctification, is Kiddush Hashem, is sanctification of the name of God. And it's interesting, which brings up the question that this is very different than, this trajectory from being a diasporic Jew in the 60s to being a kind of a post-Zionist in the in the 80s and 90s until he was assassinated, in the 80s until he was assassinated. How does this how does this fit together, and how are there followers of Kahane today in the United States and diaspora and in North America? And you said you have a great anecdote where you run across the Kahanist at a Kiddush, which is the most...
Right. No, but I have two things to say. First, there's this great line from Yossi Klein Halevi's Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist. Yossi Klein Halevi is a contemporary Israeli journalist, and he was not only a member of the JDL, but he actually was one of the editors of the JDL newsletter in the early years between 68 and 71. And he has this line in the memoirs that says as follows, describing Kahane: "No Jewish leader spoke as incessantly of love for the Jewish people as Kahane did, and none so despised his fellow Jews." And I think in a certain sense, it really kind of captures, because I think you're actually right about that. He often signs his letters for the love of the Jewish people after he basically excoriates the person he's writing to, who also happens to be a Jew. So I think what happens is, and I talk about this in the chapter on Zionism, is that there's a shift in his notion, in his idea of violence from his American career to his Israeli career. He doesn't really become a messianist in America, in Israel. He becomes an apocalyptic thinker. You can see this in his book, 40 Years, that he wrote in Ramla prison in 1984. You could see it in Thorns in Their Sides and They Must Go.
You explain the difference between messianism and apocalypticism?
Basically, messianism, you could see it in a Cookian sense. And I do talk about the fact that there's an irony in the fact that neo-Kahanism is a kind of amalgam of Cookism and Kahanism, because I think Kahane and Cook are diametrically opposed thinkers. Their worldview is opposed. Their understanding of history is completely contradictory one to the other. So the amalgam is really a self-contradiction. But basically, Kahane believed, well, the Cookian messianism notion is that the establishment of the state of Israel is the beginning of the Messianic idea, the beginning of the Messianic period. It deals with the question of the Messianic person, while the Messianic person may come at the end, and so on and so forth, and that we should involve ourselves in state building, and we should involve ourselves as if we are part of a Messianic process that is beyond us. Kahane, basically, as an apocalyptic thinker, made the case that no, we have to bring about the Messiah by creating a destructive rupture in civilization. In other words, violence is part of the redemptive process, and one doesn't have to look past the book of Ezekiel to see that the way in that's true, and Ezekiel was Kahane's favorite prophet. Violence is necessary for the Messianic era to come. The question is, will God act violently against the Jews, which is kind of what Ezekiel prophesied, or alternatively, the Jews can prevent divine violence against them by doing God's bidding and acting violently against the Arab. So in a certain sense, for Kahane, acting violently against the Arab was an apocalyptic move to prevent God from acting violently against the Jews. That's the way he presents it in Harayon Yehudi, the Jewish idea, which is his really kind of, his later kind of religious work. So he does adopt a kind of, in a certain sense, apocalypticism is about messianism with human agency, in the sense that the Jew has to bring it about by destroying the state, because the state is a secular state and therefore can't be a messianic state. There he rejects Cook's whole idea of transvaluation, and that acting violently against the Arab is for the sake of the Jew, not simply for the sake of power. That's really what it was earlier in America, but it's really for the sake of purification and cleansing. So the Jewish idea is like a Musar book for Klal Yisrael, that the Jews have to purify themselves and purify the land by doing away with the defilement of the Arab, in order that God won't intervene and act violently against the Jew.
That's fascinating. So basically, he has his ethics of violence is an attempt to put off divine violence through the power of human violence.
Exactly.
Expecting violence against Palestinians,
Right.
in order that God is not violent towards Jews. And when Jews don't act violently, then for Kahane, that is bringing God's wrath on the Jewish people.
Exactly. So it's all basically around the binary of Kiddush Hashem and Chil Hashem. It's you're either sanctifying the divine name or you're desecrating the divine name.
And
He understood the secular state as a Chil Hashem.
Right.
The secular state was a desecration of the divine name. In this way, and I have all these interesting comparisons between Kahane and Yoel Teitelbaum of Satmar, because there are some similarities. They were both anti-Zionist in relation to the secular state.
It's interesting because if you because the power that Kahane fantasized about in the 60s when he was in the States was actually the Jewish power. It was actually in reality in Israel in the state. I mean, they had the army, they had all the guns, they had all the weapons. They were actually in power. So Kahane had to fantasize a new way in which Jews were disempowered, and so they.
Look, he wanted to create a Jabotinskian movement for diaspora Jews. It's basically a diasporic revisionism.
Which is a contradiction in terms.
Of course, it's a contradiction in terms, but originally that's what happens. After about 1972, he starts to realize that he feels like after the Vietnam War ended, and there wasn't a spike in anti-Semitism, he wrote a book called Time to Go Home, which was an interesting kind of swan song to America, saying that America is the greatest democracy in the world. America has been better to Jews than any other civilization in the history of history of Jewry. And yet you see that even in America, anti-Semitism will continue. Therefore, there's no real hope that Judaism could survive in America. So he basically develops this idea of mass aliyah, of trying to promote American Jews to leave America and move to Israel. He goes to Moshe Dayan and Moshe Sharet, two politicians at that time, and he sells this mass aliyah idea to them, and they basically didn't want to have any part of it. Because interestingly enough, the government didn't want Jews in America, all the Jews in America, to move to Israel.
Right.
That's the kind of irony of the tension and the contradictory nature of the whole notion of the negation of the diaspora. On the one hand, they wanted to see the diaspora as negated, yet they wanted Jews to be in America in order to advocate for Israel.
So, yeah, I mean that's a very strong paradox at the heart of which brings me to the following question, which is where does Kahanism live in the American establishment today?
Great question. And I know that that's maybe one of the more provocative things that I try to claim in the book. I think that the American establishment, the extent that we can talk about an American establishment, because people will come back and say, well, there's no such thing as an American establishment. I frankly don't believe that. I think that there is. But the American establishment has basically rejected Kahane's tactics and by and large accepted certain aspects of his worldview. And you can hear this in things that Abraham Foxman used to say in the ADL. In other words, the notion of perennial anti-Semitism, the idea that the real enemy of the Jew is the left. That's a total Kahanist idea, right? Yeah, there's a webinar that Ruth Weiss is giving now for Tikva on the left's abandonment of the Jews or something like that. And the idea that the left is actually worse than the right, that the Black Panthers were more of a threat to the Jews than the neo-Nazis, is something that was completely anathema in the 1960s and early 1970s. So the idea of the left as being the problem, and that you have through Jewish neoconservatism, the idea of perennial anti-Semitism, the notion of Jewish pride and continuity, and creating resources and programs in order to continue to enable the Jew to identify as being a Jew in a way. Now, in some sense, we have to, here's the real break, right? Kahane was doing it before multiculturalism. Multiculturalism made that normative. Because once you introduce multiculturalism, the idea of continuity becomes a normative idea. Yes, of course, the Jew should be a Jew and the African American should be an African American. We should all live together and we should all celebrate diversity and all of those kinds of things. But in the 1960s, it was all about acculturation. It was all about accommodation. It was all about becoming more American. We were living at the end of that period. So in a way, Kahane's idea of survivalism was radical in the 60s, and continuity becomes normative in the 1990s, largely because multiculturalism helped that along.
Fascinating. And then multiculturalism becomes a politicized in the recognition of intersectional thinking, and that nobody is actually just one thing, and intersectionality is in a sense a kind of a politicized melting pot, but not.
Right. Yes.
So let's turn to some of the questions. We don't have that much time left. So here, the last question that came up is: isn't the language of violence is purifying for the Jewish people, carrying out pure fascism mixed with the notion of avoiding God's wrath against us? And then he adds, Josh adds, this seems like an exact opposite of my notion from the first chapter of my book, thanks Josh, about the Bible's mandate to act kindly like God if we are not to be punished like Pharaoh.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think in some way, the relationship with Zionism and fascism goes all the way back to Jabotinsky's relationship to the Fascist Party in Italy and Begin's relationship to the Fascist Party in Poland. In other words, the revisionist Zionist program always had a certain kind of dalliance with fascism, and that's not new. And I think that nationalism, certainly ethno-nationalism, will always have to basically fight against its fascist demons, and we're experiencing that in 2020. So I think in some way, the idea of fascism as being part of a national project is not really only part of Kahane's profile, but I think exists much broader than that. I think that Kahane would say that the idea, he would make a very simple, this is how he says it. He said, look, there are two instances, right, that one could say mythically begin Judaism. Or he would say, what would be really the origin point of the beginning of what becomes Judaism? It's Moshe killing the Egyptian. It starts with an act of violence. Or in the Midrash, right, Abraham destroying the idols in his father's shop. In other words, that violence is in a sense the originary, this is Kahane's saying, right? Violence is the originary act out of which peoplehood emerges. Now, it's interesting the fact that murder, which is really what Moshe did to the Egyptian. I mean, we can justify it because the Egyptian was beating the Hebrew, whatever it was. But the fact that the Bible is telling the story that the origin point of this whole thing is really an act of murder, an act of violence. So Kahane would say the very idea that Judaism is nonviolent simply does not bear the weight of the sources.
Right. And so what's fascinating about that is that, of course, a different point in the Exodus is another, like Aaron Shmuel Tamaris from the early 20th century Orthodox thinker, looks at the plague of the firstborn and says the reason that God smote the Egyptian firstborn and forced the Israelites into their homes and didn't allow them out is that they would get out of the cycle of violence, because all violence, even violence in self-defense, becomes offensive violence. So it's a choice where you decide to start the narrative. And of course, and so Kahane has his, decides to start it here. Others like Tamaris, and who I like, who I follow, starts it elsewhere. But that's part of so this is also a struggle about what Judaism means, not only a struggle about what is a Jew.
I mean, you could take it also to the book of Joshua and the commanded wars of basically going in and killing everybody. You could take it to the book of Ezekiel, who was basically a kind of prophet of violence, ultimately.
There was a great Moshe Greenberg, who is a great Bible scholar, was giving a lecture at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem and talking about how the imperative of teaching, especially the book of Joshua, through Midrash, in order to ameliorate that very violence. And in the audience, there was Professor Nechama Leibovitz, who is amazing both popularizer and interpreter of Bible. And she got up and after his lecture said, Professor Greenberg, I don't understand why you said that. The only reason Joshua was able to kill all these people was because God spoke to Joshua, and since there's no prophecy, this doesn't happen anymore. Right after her, somebody who is obviously a settler with the garb gets up and says, "I don't understand, Professor Greenberg. If Joshua did it, why can't we do it?" And basically, Professor Greenberg just turned to both of them and said, "I think you guys should speak to each other."
I would say in a different way, right? Now, we obviously know that within the plethora of sources within the canonical Jewish tradition, one can construct various kinds of Judaisms using those sources, right? There's no great chiddush in saying that. I think that to discount Kahane's construction of Judaism as founded on and as, in a certain sense, requiring the use of violence is to discount that as being an unjustifiable within the canonical tradition. I'm sorry, I just don't agree with it. I mean, I think that you could look at Kahane's 1,000-page Arayona Yehudi, and he'll bring you hundreds and hundreds of sources strung together, not only within the Hebrew Bible, but within Chazal too, in terms of the understanding of use of violence. Now, we're certainly able to construct another alternative vision of Judaism, but that's not to say that that vision itself can't be somehow justified from the sources.
Obviously, yes.
Yeah.
I think that's an important point. Another question, we're going to have to finish up soon. Another question comes from Brant Rosen. What was the nature of the American anti-Semitism that Kahane was responding to?
Well, the nature of the anti-Semitism Kahane responded to was on two parts. There was, of course, the kind of neo-Nazi anti-Semitism that we all know about, that existed from the time of the Nazi Party till today. But more interestingly, there was the anti-Semitism of the radicalized left, particularly among people of color, who began to identify in what they called in those days third worldism, which was a sense of identifying with people of color in other parts of the world. And after 1967, that turned into identifying with the Palestinian movement. So in a certain sense, the anti-Semitism of the left, and this is why it's very complicated, and one has to think about it within today's world too, the way that the anti-Semitism of the left is really about Zionism. It's really about the politicization of the Jew as establishing a nation state in the global South, in a place where there are people of color, and what that actually means and how they actually, enact that. Stokely Carmichael, who actually knew a lot about Zionism, said the thing that really turned him against the Zionists was the reinstitution of partnership between Israel and apartheid South Africa in the early 1970s. Golda Meir was very, very against being, dealing with South Africa, apartheid South Africa. But by 1974, for a variety of reasons that have mostly to do with economics, Israel began to trade and sell military equipment to South Africa. And at that point, for Carmichael, Zionists simply became the enemy. Now, I think that the difference is that for the neo-Nazi anti-Zionists, for the neo-Nazi anti-Semites, Zionism is not an issue. In fact, quite the opposite. Zionism is in many cases a good thing because, let the Jews just all go to Israel. For the left
state, we should have an ethno state.
Exactly. So in terms of the anti-Zionism that's coming from the African-American or the people of color community, I think it really is focused primarily on Israel. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, Israel is just a veil, really they're anti-Semitic, but I think it's a very, very complicated story. I think people are really not getting at the real undercurrent of why there is rising cases of anti-Semitism in the progressive community of color.
Thank you. All right, we're going to have to wrap up here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this incredible discussion and for bringing up so many issues that are so relevant for the way we try to understand ourselves today. I think everybody here felt very grateful for that as well. And I think we'll take all of those thoughts with us into the weekend. And of course, Professor Magid's most recent book will be out soon from Princeton University Press. I just wanted to remind everybody that we update our offerings on Biyachad Together on a weekly basis. You can log into our website on aju.edu to see what are we planning for you for next week and the week following that. You can join our mailing list and receive a weekly email announcing all of our upcoming offerings. So I just wanted to hop on again to thank you both for bringing your wisdom and your experience and your insightful perspectives to this morning and to this session, and to thank everybody who joined us, and wishing you a lovely weekend and Shabbat Shalom. And we'll see you all next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rotem. Thank you, Aryeh. Good Shabbos, everyone.
Sure.
Shabbat Shalom.